Hi all, I welcome you all to this new video wherein I'm having Luis and Rohit. Rohit is my friend from college. After the call with Gary, I thought reaching out to Luis and we'll get to know more about Mexican culture. He's from Mexico. Maybe he'll let us know. Then he lived in the United States, in Europe. So he's having like a broader worldview. So we'll just get to know each other. And the idea, Luis, for this particular call is for us to get to know your culture, your way of living, and if you have any questions related to India, okay, we're more than happy sharing that. Okay, so thanks a lot for accepting. Thanks a lot, Rohit, for being on this call. I'll simply start with you, Luis. If you can just start with a basic introduction of who you are, and yeah, so maybe over to you, Luis.
Yeah, absolutely. I think first of all, thank you, man, very much for the kind words and for inviting me. It's a pleasure to reconnect with you after having worked together. I would say, very succinctly, I'll try to be as succinct as possible. I was born in Mexico City in 1986. For those of us who want to do the math, and lived there my childhood. What I consider my childhood was in Mexico. So I lived there until the age of 10. In 1996, we then moved to the US. We'll maybe touch a little more on all the drivers behind that. But yeah, basically in 1996, we moved to the US. And that's around the time when I went sixth grade. So in sixth grade, I moved to the US without speaking the language. So I just moved directly to the US and started getting a US education. Did middle school and high school in the US and then university. So this was in Texas where we moved to Texas. And then for university, I decided to move away. I chose to move away from home. And that was the first time, not being with a parent. Went to university in the Midwest in the United States, Iowa, for those who would be familiar with the geography. And came back after university to live at home. And so that put me back in Houston, which then put me into our line of work, really, because Houston is one of the major energy hubs in the US. And so that put me into the energy work. And then after that, I started my career in the energy work there, consulting, some in-house work. That eventually, after meeting my wife, who's now my wife, but then my girlfriend, that gave me the impetus to then seek to move to Europe. And naturally, that brought me to London as well, because again, that's one of the hubs of energy trading, at least in Europe. So then London, and lived in London for a little while. That's we were working for the same company at that time. That company then took me to Dubai and Abu Dhabi. From then on, spent a couple of years as a digital nomad. So just working from many different countries. So we spent 3 years visiting about, let's say, 11 countries, something like that. We had the actual count right now. I'm just kind of finger in the air thinking what that is. And then after that, my wife, within that time was during pandemic. I got married, and then in about 2022 or so, we decided we wanted to start our family and came back to London seeking a little bit more stability. So now I live in London with my wife and my almost 2-year old. He'll be 2 in April, and yeah, still working in the energy sector, and that kind of brings us to today.
Thanks a lot, Luis, for this introduction. So if I have to summarize this, maybe initially I thought to call you as half Mexican, half American. Now it seems like one third American, one third Mexican, one third European, and bits and pieces of Middle Eastern, right? So we know there is a difference in way of living in Mexico and United States, right? So I just wanted to understand in initial phase of your life, how exactly you will define that when I have to ask you that if you're half Mexican, half American, How exactly that identity goes with you? How exactly you would like to identify yourself?
Yeah, so that's a deep question. That's a tough and difficult question that I've had to battle with in my own sort of personal life, right? So, um, what I would say is, so I consider myself culturally fully Mexican, right? But you can't live one place for 20 years and not pick up some of the culture. So, after moving to Europe, I've come to kind of embrace a little bit more my Americanness, right? Because so at home we speak Spanish, and culturally I consider myself Mexican, right? Food wise and otherwise. But it's inevitable to say after you've lived 20 years in one place, and then in fact now I've lived more in the U.S. than in Mexico. That's a fact, and that can't be denied. But it was from a identity perspective, it was difficult for me, and I'll try to explain why. Because for me, I'm spending those first 10 years in Mexico, and then not really electing to leave, but being sort of pressured to leave by economic factors and geopolitical factors at the time. We were sort of pressured to leave. So I left Mexico not wanting to leave Mexico, and I left as a child, so I didn't really choose to leave Mexico. So throughout my time in the US, I really would say I tried to kind of hang on to that Mexicanness in me, right? And it manifested itself in many ways. And, like I said, keeping the language, staying close to my roots, but also like I was eligible for an American passport, many almost 10 years before I elected to become American. So I was not even, I didn't become American until recently, until after I had moved to London, that I became American. So this would have been 2019. So if you can imagine, I arrived there. No, not if I'd say we were there illegally since 1996, and then it was not until 2019 that I became a U.S. citizen. So it took a while for me, and it was most of that was an internal identity struggle, really, of like not wanting to let go of that feeling of being Mexican, if that makes sense. Now,
Good.
um, I think the other thing I wanted to address, I think, was the second question, which was like, as a child and my impressions, at the time, and then now looking back. So Mexico was a really different place to grow up than the U.S., right? And the differences are immediate. So the US and Houston, Mexico in some ways too now, but the US is a little bit more modular, I would say. Like people drive to places, so most of the time we didn't have a car when we got there, but most people would drive, say, just to the store to get groceries, right? People drive to the stores, people drive to the other things. There isn't as many communal pits places, at least in Houston. So in Mexico, we lived in a big block of apartments where all the kids got together and played in the common areas, right? And in the US, we were living in this very tiny apartment, but there were no really other kids around. So the only place to see other children was at school. And then, you'd have one or two friends whose house you might walk to, but there was not a big place to conglomerate, right? And in Mexico or here in London, you'll see there are playgrounds set up, and you see a lot of children there, right? You see a lot of children playing there, or they're playing football, or they might just be hanging out in the places. There's like have these cage style football pitches here, and in Mexico they have a few of those as well. That's something that I immediately, when I arrived to the US, I lost, basically, right? That wasn't there. So it was a much more isolated sort of existence, coming immediately into the US. And then, as I mentioned before, knowing the language, so I had to kind of pick it up from zero. So it was a huge cultural shock for me, having a childhood in Mexico and part of a childhood in the US.
Okay.
I have next
So
question.
yeah,
Yeah, please, right.
yeah. So you find UK more similar to Mexico, as you're saying that as a culture wise than the US. as it seemed that you're saying that the parks and apartments more in the London, you can see the football fields, same as the Mexico. Yeah, Mexico, I can, I can now relate. I see people. There is a apartment where people come play small fields for the every sports. It's not like for one sports, but you can say for
Yeah.
basketball, then for football, then lot of stuff. So it is like that. That's why you currently wanted to settle in London, or you have a plan to come back to Mexico?
Well, that's a really great question. So I think the parallels between London and Mexico are more driven by the metropolis version of it, right? Like the fact that you're kind of in big cities. There are some cultural things that unite them culturally, specifically kind of sports, like football is big in both countries, it's huge. And so there's a lot of spaces built. The things that are similar here in London that were in Mexico City when I was growing up is less to do with culture and more to do with the fact that it's a big city that's so populated, right? So we're densely populated, and you see a lot of people coming together in the public spaces, whereas in a place like Houston, it's not densely populated. It's in fact
Okay.
spread out, right? But that's a good thing that you picked up on there. And then going back to Mexico, I don't see us going back to Mexico, but I do see us going back to Mexico before we would go back to the US because my wife is Finnish and she does not enjoy driving. And at least in Houston, that's you have to drive to have a decent standard of life. You end up having to drive. So if we were to move away from the UK, we'd land in Mexico well before we'd land back in the US at this point.
That shows the love for the homeland. I
Yeah,
take it this way.
it's the roots run deep.
Yeah, so maybe you have partially answered my next question, Luis. I was about to ask, and maybe we'll touch upon this in another section, next coming section, that usually the culture from where you come is having a great influence of how you are. And initially, when I said we used to talk a lot, we met a few times in Abu Dhabi outside work also, right? At Vikasam, if you remember, right? So we used to talk a lot because in our culture, we at times I feel take our life too seriously. Maybe it is for other culture as well, but the way you express maybe gives a different perspective to other people how exactly you live your life. Okay, so maybe I feel our part of world is takes everything seriously, and it is not undermining someone else's perspective of life. It is just that we take something things at times too seriously, which we should be taking it lightly. And when I see you, when I follow you, and when I used to talk to you as professional also, why I'm saying so because there's so many managers I have worked under, okay, professionally, and it was always the case that when I was reaching out to you, it is not the case that you were not feeling the pressure from leadership, right? But maybe you'll not pass that much to me.
Mhm.
Okay. And this is something your way of handling how exactly you handle your professional life. And that not only was visible in your professional work, it is also visible when I see you of your relation with your family, okay, your wife, your child, and the way you carry yourself. So is it having a lot of cultural influence, okay, or is it something I just want to understand whether this is something for you comes as part of culture, because in India we are taught to behave or carry ourselves in a certain way, respectful, how exactly we should be treating our parents, family, things like that. I just wanted to understand that, but how exactly you carry the way you carry yourself.
Yeah, well, thank you again. You're being much too kind, I think, but I appreciate it, and I'd be interested to have this sort of conversation with you because I've had a little bit of I have my own theories, right? of all the things and where they come from, whether they are cultural or whether they are personal, and there's going to be a mix there, right? I mean, by the time you and I got a chance to work together, I had already had the chance to go on a little bit of a journey where I was kind of trying to question myself, what are the important things in my life, right? And so when I think about those sorts of things, that piece is personal, right? That piece of having that journey of thinking about what are the important things in my life and what are the things that I would um value and want to pass on to people. And so one of those things was for me, I would say, being in creating an environment that I would want to join in an everyday basis, right? And so like the work in those senses is never going away, and there's always going to be more work to do. So the question then becomes like, how do we affect the environment in which we work, right? Because the work itself is kind of a given, and sometimes it's a lot, and sometimes we have a little bit of downtime to enjoy. But the work will be there, and then so we need to figure out what we're adding to that workplace, right? And then a lot of the stuff, like honestly, for me, it's a little when interacting with you guys, and I remember it was a little bit of empathy, right? I remember when you and I talked about when around the time you and I were starting to talk about it, we had this project, and it was a huge, like a very ambitious project, I would say. And it came to me that at that time we were talking about like, how do we try to get this done before a year end? And when we talked about it, there were talks about you guys or the team at large having to work during forgive me if I'm picking the wrong festival, but I think it was Diwali. That's near year. And yes, so it was
Yes.
coming to Diwali, right? And people were talking about, we were going through some UAT cycles, and people were having to come in. And for me, that was just unacceptable, right? And so when we talked about it, I was like, that's like asking me to work on Christmas, right? And it was like, that's not okay. And but Diwali doesn't have the same cultural significance to me. So I wanted to know how I can step in to make sure that we could get it an idea. And so it's just like having a maybe an interest in the people as people that you work with, right? Maybe there's a little bit of that. And then culturally speaking, I would say, Rohit, that uh that Mexicans are by and large very religious, and
Yes.
so by and large quite religious, and Mexicans are Catholic as well. And I'm not religious myself, but the culture is very deep in this religion. So from a cultural perspective, the religion, I would say, one thing that it gives to us, whether for better or for worse, is this idea of sacrifice, right? So sacrifice in Mexican culture is highly valued. If you're seen to be sacrificing for your family or for your loved ones, sacrificing for your work, it carries a certain amount of cultural capital, right? Because sacrifice is a positive thing in a person, someone who's willing to sacrifice themselves. It's kind of a cultural positive. That's a double-edged sword, right? I would say, as a having now my American and European hints as well, that I would say that ends up being a little bit of a double-edged sword. And so that's one thing that religious kind of background gives you. The other thing that it gives you is a little bit of a resignation, right? And this one again is again another bit of a double-edged sword, right? Because when you believe that certain things are not in your hands, they're either part of a larger plan, or they're just not, you know, not in your hands. It's part of a larger plan or part of a test, whatever that might be, right? You then have a little bit of a resignation. You resign yourself to what the situation is. The positive side of that, as I've discussed, I think, with my wife before, is that people tend to focus on the things that they can affect, right? There are certain things that are just not in my hands. That's, let's call it God's will. So I'm just gonna try to keep going with my life as best as I can, right? Obviously, you can take that to a place where the agency from your life goes away. So that's definitely also, both of those end up being a little bit of a double-edged sword for Mexican people.
Okay, great. So I can relate that thing. You mentioned that the Mexican people is more religious. So I had a normal conversation with one of my colleagues. So she's saying that Mexican, we can marry multiple times, but when it's come to the church, we can only marry once. We
That's
can
correct.
divorce, we can marry, by court by signing the paper, but in the church only once. So yeah, they are very rooted to their cultures and how religions, you can say.
Yeah, those numbers have gone down by a lot. The Mexicans are by and large less religious now than in every generation before them, but
Hmm.
it's still that culture that it's still there, right? It permeates. You
Yes.
can't get rid of hundreds of years of culture and mindset that is brought on by that. Now, well, I have a question for you guys because when I started this, when I started working with Indian colleagues, my first impression or my lasting impression was it's the best workforce that money can buy, right? I mean, it was like you could call your Indian colleagues at 6 in the morning or at 12 at night, and you would expect to receive a call back, or you would expect somebody to pick up the phone. And, and obviously economically for most companies, it works at a great advantage, sometimes 10 to 1 to hiring, say, a European or North American counterpart. And so, and like, I was curious because, so then I remember I asked in London a colleague of ours, and I was like, oh, where is this coming from? I can't feel like this is necessarily something like healthy for your lives in general, right? I mean, it's obviously great for advancement, and I guess we can discuss what what it brings, right? Or what are the positives and negatives of that. And he explained to me that like culturally there is, I don't want to misquote him, but I'll tell you what I got away from. I understood that there's a culture of deference, right? So the way that I remember him explaining it to me was, as you grow up, your parents are God, and then your teacher becomes God, and then work or your boss becomes the next person, right? And you would not say go into a call and say challenge the guy that is leading the call, right? You would not say no, I can't work this Saturday. That would be something that would be a little bit. Is that your impression, Aman and Rohit? What do you guys think that?
Yeah, see, you somehow you can say it's right, but now as you say that the currently the Mexican generation is now they are becoming less religious. So now in our generation, you can say the Gen Zs, they are now more like to have that boundaries between the work and their life. But we as a you can say millennial or the past, so we experience this from our parents that okay, if you have to give extension to your life, you can adjust your personal life to the work. So this we have inherit from our you can say parents or our the seniors. But now with slowly the as the time going on, you can now see the Indians even more like to they can separate their personal life and their professional life. So that's
You've
my
experienced
experience.
this, yeah.
Yeah.
I think for me, Louis, I'll break into this into three parts. First of all, like being blunt is not part of our culture. That's one thing.
Mhm.
Okay, and it doesn't naturally comes to us that okay, I can say no to you upfront, even if I'm wanting to say no in first place, right? It will not naturally come that okay, no, Louis, I'll not do that. It doesn't come. It will always come with some reasoning wherein I'll try to be defensive and explaining that why exactly I'm in that. So that's one mindset thing. But if I have to literally divide it into three category, why exactly this is, one is culture for sure. Okay. So culture wise, it is like being respectful is part of that definition, and it becomes very. It is not a black and white. Where exactly you should draw a line of being respectful, right? Whether someone is just utilizing you for their need, and you're not able to draw that line, whether you are exhausting yourself into that. A day later, maybe you're not in that good state of mind, and that is affecting your family as well, right? But gradually it is coming wherein people are more exposed to it. Okay. Second is obviously family needs, and in this particular part I remember one video from Ray Dalio. US economist.
Hmm.
And the video was like the rise and fall of an empire and how exactly the human psychology shifts. Okay, so it is like, let's suppose a country is not having many opportunities. Okay, so in that case, what will happen is people will not be choosy in picking work. Okay, they just want some work. They'll just be ready to pick anything or everything that is coming their way. Okay, but as soon as you'll have money, you'll start becoming picky and choosy that, okay, this is something not my class. I'll not do that. And then what exactly happens afterwards is like the more psychological safety, economic safety, and if you are able to take care of basic things, then you become more choosy. Okay, so if I'm economically well off, then I can bluntly say no to you. Okay, that okay, maybe I'll see something else which is. But if it is not that case, right, I have also the I'll not use the word pressure, but I also want to aspire and make myself economically stable, right? And even in India, it is if you'll say that whatever I'm earning, right, even if someone is able to earn as much as I'm able to do it, you'll be more than economically you're better than 95% of Indians, right? So though India is perceived in a different way across world, but the reality is we are a aspiring nation. Okay, and in the age of internet, we see uh, quality of life from European folks, American folks, and we want to become like that, right? And in order to reach that, if a certain degree of sacrifice gives us that leverage, okay, people for sure will go with that. But you will see this trend diminishing, as Rohit said, because our fathers and mothers generation work for survival, right? Now my survival is taken care, right? I'm working for standard of my life, right? Maybe I'll be able to take care for my children, but he will not be working for survival or standard of life. He will have that, and then he will obviously that psychology itself says that he will become more picky and choosy because he's having basic needs covered. So I think it is part of uh, history also. We are a new nation comparatively. Historically we are 5,000 plus years nation, but modern India is 75 years old only after British uh, after colonial past. So it is still comparatively a new country. Lots of issue we had, and we are still trying to come out of that. And these are the major reasons I see. The way you said, people are more obedient, if I have to use that word, and they'll be more respectful, and that is also part of culture, being respectful. So I'll summarize it this way, because this is our need also. It is not that is something that this comes naturally, but this is part of need also, that we have to be like this. Maybe you'll not see same thing maybe in a decade or two.
Yeah, I would expect that to be the case. And I had professionally something that pointed in that direction as well. I worked for a consulting company, and then we had a you know, every consulting company, every consulting project is at some point high pressure, right? Because you're meeting up delivery deadlines and things like that. But I actually ran into a scenario in which one of my younger people that were working with me, she happened to be Indian, and this wasn't the most comfortable thing for me, because in the end, like, apparently she was experiencing a little bit of burnout. But um it came to my notice because she had basically put a complaint, really, right? I mean, there's no other way to really phrase it. But I was see, aside from the fact that somebody had put a complaint on me, which hadn't happened in the past, and it was an interesting thing to happen. But
Okay.
I was really pleased that she actually found somebody to talk to, and that she said, "Hey, you know, I'm starting to feel this thing, and I'm starting to feel burnout." I had just wished that, you know, if looking back at that, that I would have been the person that she would have talked to, right? Because I would have obviously been open to that and quite pleased. But I was, you know, I walked away with the from the experience thinking like, this is a good this is a good development generationally, right? So the generations coming behind you guys are going to have to are going in what I would consider a decent direction. and they're just going to have big shoes to fill because your guys' generation has set the bar quite high in this kind of services industry, I would say.
Yes.